If I could have your attention, please. I'd like to begin my lecture for today. So what I'm going to do today is obviously carry on from where I left off day before yesterday, and I've been speaking to you about events in the late 1930s. That's the point at which I terminated my discussion, and we're obviously going to now go on to the partition, to the negotiations for independence. The partition, what exactly do we mean when we speak about the partition of India, and its immediate aftermath. So that's the objective today, is to take us to about early 1948, which is the time at which Mahatma Gandhi is going to be assassinated, so 6 months after the achievement of Indian independence. Now, in order to get to that point, let me go back then to the 1930s, and I want to reinforce 2 points that I made to you at that juncture. One is that when World War II broke out in 1939, you may recall that I had mentioned that the Congress, which was the preeminent organization representing Indian nationalists and Indian sentiment, that the Congress declared itself to be neutral in the conflict. And I discussed this at some length because I want all of you to understand that a position of neutrality did not mean that the Congress obviously endorsed fascism. It didn't. People like Nehru were in fact ferocious anti-fascists, and Nehru had been quite active in the League Against Imperialism in the 1930s. People like Nehru and Gandhi and many others had developed vast networks with people who were to be viewed as anti-fascists. But the position that the Congress had adopted was that the war that Britain was now engaged in was Britain's war. This was a European war. And I think there's something to be said for that, just as there's something to be said for the fact that World War I mean, why do we call it World War I? Who's really involved in it? Right? I mean, these are largely European wars. World War II, of course, is going to bring in an element in the Pacific, which is a different story. But one must view much of this history, which is very often passed off as a history that should concern everybody, that this is, in fact, an aspect of European history. Right? The second thing that I suggested to you was that in 1937, there were these provincial elections. And as late as 1937, the Muslim League was not able to actually make an impression upon Muslims, right? And by which I mean that Muslims were not persuaded that the Muslim League, which was a political party set up to represent the interests of the Muslims, a political party set up with the active encouragement and connivance of the British in the early part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, Muslims were not persuaded as late as 1937 that the Muslim League necessarily represented their interests. And even in parts of India which had Muslim majorities, the Muslim League was not able to prevail. Now, the situation is going to radically alter in the following years, and one reason for that, of course, is what transpires between 1939 and 1945, which is the year of the span that you have to look at when you're looking at World War II. Because when the war broke out and Congress officially adopted a position of neutrality, one of the consequences was that the Congress would in some ways become marginalized. And in 1942, Gandhi is going to initiate what is called the Quit India movement. Okay, so that phrase "quit India" shows, of course, suggests to some degree the intention, which was that this was going to be the last attempt made by Indian nationalists and the Indian masses to throw the British out of the country. Right? So it's called the Quit India movement. The proclamation of Quit India is made in early August 1942, and within 24 hours of the proclamation of Quit India, the Congress leadership had all been put in jail by the British. Right? So, there are going to be 50,000 people who are going to be sent into jail virtually overnight once Gandhi issues the call for Quit India. So now think about what's happening. The Congress has become marginalized. Right? The Congress leadership, and we're not talking just about Gandhi and Nehru and Sardar Patel, the major figures. We're talking about people who are at the second, third, fourth, fifth tier of leaders all of them are going to be put away. There are some people who are going to go into hiding. There's going to be an underground kind of movement against the British at that point in time. But that history need not detain us at the moment, because we are interested really in going up to 1947 as soon as we can and trying to understand what is going to transpire during the time of the partition. So the Congress is going to become marginalized. The Muslim League takes a very different position with respect to World War II. The Muslim League decides that it's going to support the British war effort. And it is in this political vacuum, that is a vacuum created by the fact that the Congress has now become marginalized, partially because of its position of neutrality, partially because the British have defanged the Congress by arresting all of its major leaders. The Muslim League is now going to acquire a role of prominence. And one of the arguments that has been advanced by historians, and I think it's largely true, I mean, if one was doing a much more detailed, specialized study, one would have to introduce various kinds of nuances, as one would have to into many of the arguments that I'm making. But if you're looking at the totality of the picture, I think one can safely agree with the assessment that most historians have made, namely that when the Congress abandoned the scene, as it were, the Muslim League stepped in. They took advantage of the situation. The British rewarded them. And what you're going to find at the end of World War II is that the Muslim League is now in a position to be able to enforce some of its demands. And what is the principal demand? Who is a Muslim League being led by? Its principal leader is Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Okay? Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of what is then eventually going to become known as Pakistan. Like Gandhi, Jinnah is a Gujarati. Like Gandhi, he's a lawyer, trained, as most Indian lawyers were at that point in time in Britain. Right? They're going to go their separate ways. And again, a long history of how that really happened, because earlier on in his life, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a member of the Congress Party. But eventually he takes the view that the political interests of the Muslims cannot be represented by the Congress Party. That even though the Congress claims to be a pan-Indian secular party, that in effect it is going to be representing Hindu interests. Right? So it is from this that the idea of the two nations is going to develop, what is called the two-nation theory, that is that the Muslims and the Hindus constitute separate nations. And there are other people who are involved in authoring this idea as well. I mean, in fact, actually the principal architect of the idea in some ways is a poet-philosopher by the name of Sir Muhammad Iqbal. Okay? And Jinnah is coming on into the scene later on, but Jinnah is a politician. And so what he's going to do is he's going to capitalize on this idea, and he's going to put forward the claim that the Muslims of India, in fact, cannot be represented by the Congress Party, and that if there should be independence, the Muslims should be given a separate nation state. Right? And thus the demand for what is going to become known as Pakistan. So that's the context that you have to keep in mind when you begin to see the emergence of Pakistan. Now we need to pause here for a few minutes to try to understand very briefly the relationship of Hindus to Muslims. Because if we don't do that and we fall into the default position that is aired by Jinnah, namely that the two are in fact separate nations, then we have surrendered a lot of ground. Why should we accept the claim that the Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations? Right? And the British, by the way, had, this is a quotation I mention in every class that I teach that has to do with Indian history, because it's a wonderful way of trying to encapsulate what the differences are, because there is a British claim there as well, and the British claim which goes back to the 19th century. Remember that the Muslim League was promoted and encouraged by the British. Right? And the way that the British would very often put it was that if you want to understand the difference between the Hindu and the Muslim, think of the fact that the Hindu worships the cow. Okay, you know, the cow is a sacred, revered animal. The Hindu worships the cow, the Muslim loves to eat the cow. Right? This was the dramatic way that they would put it. Right? Hindus don't eat beef and the Muslim loves meat. Right? And of course, from their point of view, this was a way of defining the fact that these people stood at the polar opposites. The Muslims belong to a monotheistic religion, right? This religion has a historical founder. It has one single book. And Hinduism, of course, is this massive, vastly disorganized, chaotic religion with thousands of texts, millions of gods and goddesses. Right? There was this formula that was always given, 330 million gods and goddesses. Not that anybody had ever taken a census of these 330 million gods and goddesses. Right? But that these two religions are about as different as two religions can ever be. And so, of course, the question that arose then was, how do the adherents of these two religions inhabit the same space? And can they inhabit the same space on relatively equal grounds? You can always have two people inhabiting the same space on vastly unequal grounds. I mean, after all, African Americans and whites inhabited the same space, but on vastly unequal grounds. And there were then those who argued, and I would be inclined to accept that argument. There were those who argued that, in fact, what had been created in India was something that was wholly distinct, not to be replicated anywhere else in the world. Namely, that India furnished the best example, the singular example of a place where Islam had come into close interaction with a markedly different culture and had, in fact, ended up creating a new cultural synthesis. Because you do have to think about this. You have to think about the fact that if you look at Islam's expansion in other parts of the world, after the birth of Muhammad, the Prophet, and the rapid expansion of Islam is something that we are all aware of, that within years after his death, Islam begins to sweep large parts of what you would describe as Central Asia, eventually portions of Europe, and we know that large parts of the world are going to fall under Muslim rule. Now, Islam had been present in India for over 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Okay? So the first Muslim incursions into India are going to occur several decades after the death of Muhammad, and we know that Western India is going to fall, portions of Western India are going to fall under Muslim rule by the 8th century. The North India is going to fall under Muslim rule beginning effectively in the 11th century, and when the British come to India, the dominant political dynasties in North India are all Muslim. And there's, of course, a strong Muslim presence in other parts of India, but then there are large parts of India which never fell under Muslim rule. So India was certainly the exception in many ways. That notwithstanding the long presence of Islam in India did not become preeminently a Muslim country. And at the time of partition, in undivided India, the Muslim population of undivided India was approximately 25%. 25%. Now this is a very complicated set of questions. Why wasn't Islam able to make the same gains in India as it was able to make in the rest of the places that fell under its jurisdiction? That's a long series of complicated questions which we are not going to enter into. The same question could be asked about why is it that Christianity did not make much of a headway in India, because when India fell under British rule, while you might have expected that over a period of several decades, substantial portions of the Indian population would convert to Christianity. It happens very often that people will convert to the religion which is a religion of the ruler, because there are gains to be made from such conversions. It did not happen in India. At the time that the British left in India, less than 3% of the country was Christian. Christians constitute 2.5% of the population of India. Right? So keep all of that in mind. And the question here is that should we accept the two-nation theory or not, and what is it that eventually made it possible for a substantial number of people to accept the two-nation theory? Now, after 1945, when the war ends, there's going to be a change of government in Britain. So even though Churchill had very successfully led the British in defeating the Nazi menace, as it used to be called, right, and putting an end to fascism, Churchill's government was thrown out of power, because one of the things, of course, that the British realized is that it takes a certain kind of person to lead a nation in wartime, but in peacetime, you might want a different kind of leader. And Churchill, of course, was an exceedingly aggressive leader. And Churchill was also completely hostile to the idea of Indian independence. I don't think I would be exaggerating if I said to you, and I think you can check it up by looking up the Churchill archives and looking up books on Churchill if you were interested, but Churchill had nothing but contempt for India and Indians. I mean, he was unquestionably a racist down to the last bone of his body. Right? Notwithstanding the fact, of course, that in Britain and in the United States, he is valorized as one of the greatest figures in world history because, of course, he saved Britain from the Nazi menace, etc., etc. The critical thing, again, you don't have to go along with that. What is critical is that in 1945, at the end of the war, Churchill is going to be thrown out of power. A Labour government is going to come into power, headed by a man called Clement Attlee. And Attlee is immediately going to say that the independence of India is one of the objectives of my government. Okay, because of course there had been a demand for independence, so now the British realize, and there's a long and convoluted discussion of, obviously in scholarly circles, what were the exact circumstances under which the British left. So for example, in Britain, this whole process is described by a very benign, neutral phrase called the transfer of power. So there's a huge series of documents. I mean, it's like several huge volumes, and each volume is 1,000 pages, and this whole volume is called the transfer of power. So when you think about the transfer of power, you think about there's a peaceful transition. One government and then another government comes into power. Well, this was not a peaceful transition that we're talking about, and we're not talking about a transition from one democratically elected regime to another democratically elected regime. We're talking about the transition from colonialism to independence. Right? So that there has been a British view for a very long period of time that effectively, well, what the British did was, and this is one reason why they view their rule as successful, we peacefully transfer power from ourselves to the native people. Okay? There are, of course, other views. And those competing views have to do with the fact that Britain, at the end of the war, had become an immensely weakened power. It simply could not hold on to India. That, of course, even though Britain had prevailed in the war, much of Britain had been destroyed. I mean, if you look at, for example, the bombing of British cities, right? Okay? And that the war economy had, in fact, substantially reduced the ability of Britain to be able to hold on to its empire. There was also other ideological considerations. One of the platforms under which the British and the Americans fought the war was this whole idea that self-determination of people is important. Right? So if self-determination of people is important, well, how do you hold on to all your colonies at the end of the war? Right? So there are a great many factors which are impinging upon the whole situation and which eventually make it necessary that Britain should withdraw from India as soon as possible. And so this is what Clement Attlee is effectively going to promise. Now, there's another long convoluted history. You have just a slight glimmer of that in the reading that you have, the Shumit Sarkar reading, right? The last chapter of his book, Modern India, which describes briefly politically what happened between 1945 and 47. It's a long history, but we're not really interested in the details of it. What we are interested in simply is trying to understand what were the negotiations for Indian independence with respect to the question of the Muslim demand for a separate nation state. And that's what we are principally interested in. Because the consequence of partition is the creation of a new nation state, in addition to the fact that India is going to become free. Right, so if you turn your attention to this slide over here, negotiations for Indian independence, Shimla Conference, cabinet mission, these are all various mechanisms that are devised by the British to try to bring Indian leaders to a table and say, well, let's try to discuss what are the terms under which independence is going to be given. Right? Will there be a separate nation state carved out for the Muslims? And if there is going to be a separate nation state carved out for the Muslims, what will this nation state look like? Now let me introduce a couple of other complications. We'll go back to the slide. Let me introduce a couple of other complications. One of the things that is commonly not understood about India is that In 1947, before independence, only 2/3 of the country was directly under British rule. 1/3 of the country was not directly under British rule. All right, and I want to sort of dwell on that a little bit because the consequences of this again will begin to unravel when the partition is going to be achieved in 1947. All right, now let me show you another slide, and then we'll go back to this one over here. So if you look at this slide over here, okay, so and look at the key over here. So these portions that are in a darker shade over here, or brown, Indian states and territories, and then the lighter one indicates British India. That's what the key tells you here. Okay, so Rajputana, for example, all right, Rajputana is a collection of what are called native states. There were over 550 native states in India. Some of them were the size of the UCLA campus. Okay? They were small. Some of them were the size of a large American state, such as Kashmir, if you go to the top over there. Or if you look at Hyderabad. Hyderabad is also the name of a city, but there was a Hyderabad state, ruled by a man called the Nizam of Hyderabad, at one point the wealthiest man in the world. Right? Kashmir on top over there is ruled by a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, Hindu ruler, but over 90% of the population is Muslim. Right? I'm just laying out a few things for you to think about. And we're saying that before the partition in 1947, there are 550 native states, independent states. Now, the word independent is misleading because these 550 states did not have the power to have sovereign diplomatic relations with other countries. The ruler of Hyderabad could not have diplomatic relations with France or Germany or the United States. No. They had limited autonomy. So in matters pertaining to education, they had complete autonomy. But they did not have autonomy in matters pertaining to defense. Obviously, they did not have autonomy in matters related to foreign affairs. Right? I mean, this is by no means a perfect analogy, but I just put it forward to you just so that it helps you understand a little bit. Think about the American Indian tribes. You know, many of them are constituted into what are called nations. And in principle, there is limited sovereignty for the American Indian nations today. Some sovereignty. Federal troops cannot simply go into what is called a Native American reservation just like that. Of course, these Native American nations do not have the right to conduct foreign relations, right, with other states. They do not have the right to have their own army. They do not have the right to mint their own currency. Right? So the situation is something like that. And one reason why Britain had these allowed these native states after 1857, 1858, after the rebellion was crushed in 1857-58, is that they found that this was the most effective way to govern the country. That you didn't need to absorb all of these territories and make them a part of British India, but you needed to exercise some degree of control over what was happening there. So what would the British do? They would post a man, okay, who was called the resident. And then the resident would be their emissary to the ruler of that state. Now, when partition is going to come around in 1947, the question that is going to come to mind, we're leaving aside the Hindu-Muslim question for the moment. There are places where, of course, the Hindu-Muslim question is going to intersect with the question of the native states. Right? But let's leave aside the Hindu-Muslim question for a moment. The question that is going to come about is, if we create a separate state out of the territories of British India for the Muslims, what about the 550 plus native states? Okay? Are they going to become all sovereign countries? Clearly that was not possible. You're not going to have 550 nation states emerging out of India. If they're not, what is their status going to be? Are they going to be absorbed into India? Are they going to be absorbed into Pakistan? Essentially, each of these native states had three options. De facto, there were only two options. In principle, there were three options. One was you sign a treaty of accession, as it was called, and say that, I relinquish all claim to my territories, and I agree that my territories will now become absorbed into India. Option number two, exactly the same thing, except that the ruler says, I agree that all my territories will now be absorbed into Pakistan. Option number three, I want to remain an independent ruler. Try that out, is what, of course, everybody would tell that person. Try to become a separate sovereign ruler, right? And there are going to be a number of states where there's going to be a contest, if I may put it this way. Okay? So that's one part of the picture that you need to keep in mind. Now let's go back to 1945, 1946. All right? So negotiations for Indian independence are taking place, and there is this demand for the partition of India, eventually along Muslim majority lines. So I want you to just look at one of the maps here now to try to understand exactly what's going on. Okay? And if you look at this map, the partition of India 1947, so you see it says West Pakistan here, and it says East Pakistan here. So this is after partition became a reality. Okay? Muslims are scattered throughout the country. I mentioned to you that the percentage of Muslims in undivided India was approximately 25%. But then you have Muslim majority provinces, and when we say Muslim majority provinces, we're referring to, of course, West Pakistan over here, what becomes West Pakistan, and East Pakistan here. There are also Muslim majority areas such as Hyderabad. There's a city over here called Lucknow. You can see that right over here. This was a Muslim majority area. And there are other cities and towns with substantial Muslim populations. The city of Calcutta, okay, over here, the city of Calcutta, the Muslim population was approximately 23.5%. 23.5%. The major city in eastern India used to be the capital of the British in India before, in the 20th century, just 25 years before independence, effectively, the British moved their capital to New Delhi. Right? They used to call it the second city of the British Empire after London. Okay? Calcutta. So whoever gets Calcutta, is it going to go to Pakistan? Is it going to go to India? I mean, if you had to hypothetically think of it that way, it gets a prized possession. But the Muslim population of Calcutta is only 23.5%. In this large portion of eastern India over here, the non-Muslims constituted approximately 47%. The non-Muslims, that is Hindus and others. It could include Christians, it could include tribal people, right, who are neither Hindu nor Christian. Okay, so, but as the single largest group would be Muslims, 53% approximately. So now the question is, if you're going to create a separate nation state of Pakistan, that is a state which is going to be for Muslims. Okay? Although Muhammad Ali Jinnah, by the way, was somebody who was sworn to the idea of secularism. In fact, he made it very clear that he wanted a secular Pakistan. Now, of course, it's not clear how that is to be interpreted, because if a new nation state is going to come around and it's going to be for the Muslims, well, it's not really a secular state. But he did not think of himself as creating a theological state. And what he meant to say, of course, was that in Pakistan, even though the Muslims will be a majority and therefore they'll feel secure, all other minorities, religious minorities, perhaps linguistic minorities, right, all other minorities ought to feel safe and secure. Okay? That was his vision, because he understood fully well that if you create a nation state, and something I talked about in the first lecture, you have to create the boundaries of that state. Well, how do you draw the boundaries? Where do you decide the boundary is going to be? Why is it here? Why is it not over here? Okay? And is it going to go through this village or that village? Right? What is it going to cut through? And as I mentioned to you, sometimes boundaries are drawn along what are considered to be natural boundaries. So if there's a river, let's supposing there's a river throughout, well, you say, well, maybe that'll be the boundary. Okay? But what we're talking about here is a situation where you've got Muslims. This is a Muslim majority area. This is another Muslim majority area. You're not going to create two separate nation states, and you're not going to create a third here in Hyderabad, and a fourth in Lucknow, and a fifth in Kashmir, so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. It's going to be one state for the Muslims. So what Jinnah thought would happen in part would be that if there happened to be a majority of Muslims, a substantial majority of Muslims in a certain area, that would fall into Pakistan, but there would still be non-Muslims living there. And this is what he thought a secular Pakistan would look like. It would be a majority of Muslims, but that other religious minorities could continue to live there. Of course, the question is why he thought that was possible, and why he didn't think that exactly the same thing could happen in India. That is, that there was then no need for partition at all. Because, of course, the claim of the Congress Party was that, yes, Hindus are going to be in a majority, but there's no reason why Muslims should feel insecure over here. Right? So I'm saying that if you pursue this logic rigorously, frankly, it's not very compelling. But in 1946, there are going to be elections, provincial elections once again. Now, in comparison to 1937, in 1946, the situation has radically altered. It's radically altered partly because the Congress had been sidelined during the entire period of the war. You had Muslim League activists who were going out into the villages and towns and essentially spreading the word that something called Pakistan may well come into being, right? And that this idea ought to have attraction for you. The essence of the matter is that in 1946, when the provincial elections take place, in the Muslim majority areas, the Muslim League won all the seats where Muslim candidates had stood for election. So if a Muslim candidate had stood for election, okay, and you had a largely Muslim electorate, that is, people who are voting, in that particular area, the Muslim League won all of those seats. Now, when that happened, it became very clear that partition was now inevitable. Inevitable. Okay, and rather than going through the nitty-gritty detail, because that can take us days to discuss all the negotiations and everything that kept on going on, the essence of the matter is that by early 1947, when a new viceroy comes, new viceroy is a governor general, right? Because India is still a British colony at this point in time. And so they appoint a man called Mountbatten with royal pedigree. He's related to Victoria and all of that. Okay, so he is going to become the new viceroy, the new governor general of India, and he's going to issue a proclamation that the intention of the British is to withdraw from India by mid-1948. In fact, the date is going to be pushed later on to mid-1947. 6 months from the time that he actually became the governor general. Right? Now, and when this partition takes place, the new nation state comes into being, but with, of course, calamitous consequences. And there are several chapters of this history before this which are of interest. I mention only one. So in 1946, in order to push this matter aggressively, the Muslim League is going to call for what is called Direct Action Day in Calcutta. So this leads to what is called the Great Calcutta Killing of August 1946. So essentially the Muslim League is going to send out its activists, and they're basically going to propagate a regime of terror, and the Hindus are going to reciprocate. Okay? They're going to reciprocate. So you're going to have this massive killing that's going to take place in Calcutta in 1946. Eventually the number of Muslims killed is higher than the number of Hindus, partly because Calcutta was largely a Hindu city. Remember that the Muslim population is about 23.5% in Calcutta. But what the Great Calcutta Killing of 1946, of August 1946 is going to do, and we're talking about approximately 10,000 people who might have been killed on the streets of Calcutta in the matter of a few days. What it's going to do is it's going to, of course, further make the idea of partition inevitable, because what the Muslim League is trying to do is it's trying to press forward this demand that, look, you have to recognize that the vivisection, the division of India, is now inevitable. And when this vivisection takes place, it's going to lead to a very odd configuration for Pakistan. I mean, there's really nothing in history which is a precedent for something like this. So one half of the country is going to be here. That's why it's called West Pakistan. The other half of the country is going to be over here, East Pakistan, because these are the two big Muslim majority areas. Now, Jinnah did not think, the Muslim League leaders did not think that the partition of India would also lead to the partition of the Punjab and the partition of Bengal. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that was that if you look at this map here now, so you see the Punjab over there, okay? So here's Rajputana, and then on top of that is the Punjab. So Jinnah thought that, well, the Punjab itself is not going to be partitioned. In other words, all of the Punjab will now become Pakistan. But of course, that was not going to happen. Why? Because in eastern Punjab, in the eastern portion of Punjab, the population was predominantly Hindu. It's only in the western portion of the Punjab that the population was predominantly Muslim. So when Jinnah said, we have to have partition, the Congress response in part was going to be, yes, but then we're going to have to partition the Punjab, and we're going to have to partition Bengal over here. Because again, the same situation here, that the eastern part is predominantly Muslim, but the western part, including Calcutta, the city of Calcutta, is predominantly Hindu. And so when the partition took place, Calcutta came into India. It fell into what was going to be India. Yes?
Isn't the Punjab predominantly Sikhs?
No, not predominantly. It is known as the land of the Sikhs because this is where the Sikhs have most of their presence. But in relation to the Hindus and Muslims, it's a much smaller group of people. So the bulk of the Sikhs come from the Punjab, but when the bulk itself is only 15 million, and you've got 50 million Hindus, then they're still smaller than the Hindus and the Muslims. Okay? And of course, the Sikhs are going to demand their own nation state. If the Muslims can demand their own nation state, why shouldn't they? That was going to be one line of reasoning. We're not going to entertain that possibility right now and go into that history, but we'll do that when we get to what happens in India in the 1970s and 80s in the Punjab. Okay? But that's the brief answer to your question. All right, so now what is going to happen then is that the Punjab and Bengal are themselves going to be partitioned. And what this map shows you is something that was not anticipated by anyone. The immense transfer of populations. So this is what the arrows show you. So, and 5.9M means 5.9 million people are going to be moving. And who are these people who are moving? If the arrow is going west, it's Muslims. The Muslims, because if you've drawn the line somewhere, and how arbitrary is a line is an interesting question. I think I mentioned to you very briefly, in my first lecture, the circumstances under which the lines were drawn. They bring a man from England, okay, from United Kingdom. Why did they bring him? Interesting question. His chief claim to being able to do the job is that he knew nothing about India. Now, that sounds very odd, but it is in fact the case. He knew absolutely nothing about India. He positively loathed the country, had no interest in it, and they said, we're going to bring you. Why? Because the British view was, let's supposing the British have been ruling India after all for a long period of time. You've got British officers who've been in India for generations. Their families have been there for generations. I mean, there were Britishers who were born in India, right? And their grandfather had been born in India. So for 4 generations, there were Britishers whose families had been in India. And they had helped to rule India, govern India. Why not go to them? They know the country, right? No, but the British, you couldn't, of course, go to Indians. Why? Because before an Indian is an Indian, he is a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. Okay, that's a British view. And I want you to think about that because this is what's going to be known as communalism later on. We're going to talk about it. The British view was that an Indian never thinks of himself as an Indian first. First, he or she thinks of himself as a Muslim, or a Hindu, or a Sikh, or a Jew, or whatever the case may be. Then the Hindu thinks of himself after that as a Brahmin, or as a Vaishya, or as a Kshatriya, or a Shudra. That is, that the caste identification becomes important. And then he thinks of himself as an Indian as an afterthought. As an afterthought. So, in other words now, if you want to divide the country, and you want to figure out where you're going to have the boundary, well, you cannot consult the Indians, because a Hindu will definitely be prejudiced towards his fellow Hindus. A Muslim will definitely be prejudiced towards his fellow Muslims. And therefore, you're not going to have neutrality. So why not go to British officers in India? They, after all, have impeccable credentials. They're honest. They're not prejudiced. That's a British view. Yeah, but there's one problem. If they've lived in India too long, they've been contaminated by living with the Indians too long. So the Indians are going to be, telling things in their ears. Do this, do that. They're going to be persuaded. They're going to be moved. You want to bring somebody from the United Kingdom who has absolutely no connection with India whatsoever, because this is the only assurance that you're going to have somebody who's going to be completely neutral. Right? This is the British view. So they bring Sir Cyril Ratcliffe, and he's appointed the chairman of what is called the Boundary Commission. And he's going to now set the boundaries. And he does this in a period of about 5 weeks. Right? They're going to pore over maps of this area on the west, maps over here. There are going to be a few people in the commission who are actually going to go and do a sort of a field study. Well, you can't really do a field study of such an immense area in 5 weeks. Okay? But effectively, they're just going to sit at their desk. They're going to pore over these maps and say, well, we're going to draw the line through this village. And by the way, when they drew the line through a particular village, it happens to be 50% Muslim, 50% Hindu, well, what do you do? Where, right? And so the Manto stories that you have, you've got these short stories. They're wonderful stories because they give you an extraordinary insight into some of the dimensions of the partition. That's why they're being given. Because it's a kind of a madness, frankly. Right? And, there are detailed records that for a particular village, if they decided to partition it, 60% of the Hindus, get left behind. So 60% of the population is now in India, 40% is now in Pakistan. Random figure, okay? So you have a school, 60% of the desks are going to be given to India, 40% are going to be given to Muslims. 60% of the pencils and chalks are going to be given to the Muslims, 40% to the Hindus, etc., etc. Everything had to be partitioned. Right? Fairly detailed records of some of this. So you have this immense transfer of population. So these are people who are now going, so these are Muslims who are going to Pakistan, and then you've got Hindus, because they've been left behind now. The way the line has been drawn, they're being left behind in a Muslim majority state. Remember that Jinnah's vision was that, well, there's no reason for the Hindus to leave if they happen to get left behind in Pakistan, because they're going to be secure here. Nobody believed that. Certainly not after the great Calcutta killing of 1946. Right? And so you're going to have Hindus who are going to move. So this is what these arrows are here, 1.2 million from here, 4.1 million from further up close to Lahore. And you're going to have exactly the same thing happening over here in this part of the country. And we're going to have a map of Pakistan, which is really peculiar, because one of the things they say about Pakistan is that the only way you can draw a map of Pakistan is by first drawing a map of India. So if your whole idea was to become autonomous, independent, right, it's a rather peculiar situation, because certainly you cannot, right? I mean, imagine if you drew a map of a country. So India, you can see that you could draw a map and say, this is India. But Pakistan, let's suppose you didn't want to draw India, and you're a kid in a school, and you're learning history. So this is Pakistan here, and this. Well, that's not much of a map, if you ask me, right? The only way a Muslim could understand cartographically his or her identity was by first understanding the cartographic identity of the enemy. Right? Something they didn't think about, Because, of course, the social, cultural, psychological elements of the story are just as important. Now, when they have this transfer of populations, how many people are we talking about total? 11 to 15 million people moving in a period of about 4 months. And you would have these long caravans of people, long caravans. Okay? We're talking about huge assets, mainly in land, abandoned by people. You are a rich Hindu landlord. The line is drawn in such a way that now you're in Pakistan. You flee for your life. What do? You leave behind all your lands. You leave behind all your lands. And of course, there was a plan that you would be compensated by the government of India or by the government of Pakistan, depending on whether you were Muslim or Hindu, right? We know that some people got compensation. It was never, of course, market compensation. It was always set at a much lower rate, and some people got no compensation at all. And it induced an enormous bitterness, which you can see down to the present day. An enormous bitterness. 11 to 15 million people. 15, I think, is the minimum, frankly. The most dense transfer of population in history over a short period of time. 1 million people, approximately, are going to be killed in the partition. And they're going to be killed because of this animosity that has developed. Some people are going to take advantage. It's like any situation where you have political turmoil. People will take advantage of it. You know, there's a riot that takes place in South Central LA, and you're not really involved in it. You're driving by, you see, hey, there's a store that's been abandoned now. Well, let me just pick up a little Sony television. Why not? Or maybe an iPhone. If that sort of thing happens. So there are people who are going to settle personal scores. There are people who are going to be killed because they're hugely embittered. They've lost their lands. Right? There's going to be abduction of women. That's another extraordinary chapter. Approximately 75,000 women, maybe 100,000 women are supposed to have been abducted. I'm looking at women on both sides put together. And when I say abduction, what I'm referring to is a Hindu woman or a Muslim woman. Okay? So let's say her family has been killed. Right? So she is going to be taken by the other side, very often converted, okay, and she starts a new life there. And the governments of India and Pakistan are going to come up with this scheme. It is called a plan for the recovery of abducted women. So there's going to be a formal legal agreement between India and Pakistan. And the formal legal agreement requires each state to go to the other country now to find women of its faith and bring them back. So let's supposing a Hindu woman has been abducted. She is now living in Pakistan, and she's living in a little village. She's been there for 4 or 5 years. Right? She may have been married before. She may not have been married. She may have had children before. The situation would vary. If she had children before, she have lost contact with them. If that is, they survived at all. Right? So let's supposing she goes to She is abducted. She now begins to live in a Muslim family. She's been converted to Islam. 4 years later, there's a knock on her door, and a representative of the Indian state says, I've come to take you back home. Literally. I've come to take you back home. Well, what is home for her now? That's the first question. Now, she's got a new home, and yes, initially she may not have been thrilled at all, even remotely, at the prospects of what had happened. She's been abducted, she's been taken into this other family, but let's supposing that, well, she's reconciled herself to what's happened, and now she has children with her Muslim husband. And then the Indian state knocks on the door and says, we're going to take you back home. All right? And if she goes back home, what assurance is there that she's not going to be thrown out immediately because her natal family is going to say, you've been living as a Muslim, you're contaminated. And vice versa, by the way, of course, right? Exactly the same argument on the other side. Right? You're going to get this scenario. 75 to 100,000 women who are going to be abducted. And an official agreement between the states of India and Pakistan. So there's a lot here that is completely unprecedented. Right? But this map here shows you the transfer of populations. So let me go back to this slide now. So we've talked about negotiations for Indian independence, the plan to partition India, what is called the transfer of power, the notion of Muslim majority provinces, the two-nation theory, right? Yes?
Who's now not taken,
No, 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 it's not in the same geographical, it's hundreds of kilometers away. Take a look at the map. Take a look at the map over here. Lucknow is over here. Lucknow is over here, Punjab is over here. It's 600, 700, 800 miles away. In fact, there was a theory that the Muslim League had. Okay? There was a plan. The plan was that you would have a corridor, literally. So this would be a corridor, you would draw up a corridor. So let's supposing there are a lot of Muslims over here. So you draw a little tunnel, as it were, okay? And then the tunnel goes all the way to Allahabad because there are lots of Muslims over here. And let's supposing there happen to be a lot of Muslims here. The tunnel goes through like this. This would be a Muslim-safe corridor. What, how are you going to actually make that work, right? And is that actually a part of the nation state of Pakistan? Of course, that idea was dropped. It was put forward, but it couldn't be implemented, you know. But no, Lucknow is much too far away. I mean, that was a whole problem. And of course, the other, I mean, the interesting elements which we can't get into because it will get us into enormous detail, which we can't really cover here, because many of the proponents of the partition came from the United Provinces, because this was the heartland of Muslim intellectuals, if I may put it this way. Most of them did not migrate. So now, you know, once a partition is announced, it becomes a reality. A lot of the proponents of this theory sort of understood what the ramifications were, did not like them, and backed out. But by this point in time, partition itself had become inevitable, you know. And because, of course, you could all, the same thing is going to happen over here, Hyderabad. Well, how are you going to connect Hyderabad to Calcutta or to East Bengal? I'm talking about a distance of hundreds of miles over here. All right. So this is the scenario that we're roughly speaking about. Now let's go back, and then the creation of Pakistan. I've told you a little bit about Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Muhammad Ali Jinnah is going to die very soon after independence. Not assassinated. He dies of an illness. Some people, you know, the kind of people who do popular history said, if only the Indian government had known, if the Congress party would have known, they would have just dodged the whole issue for one more year, because then the greatest advocate of Pakistan would have died, and then there would have been no Pakistan. Well, you know, states don't come about just because of one man. There are much greater forces at work here, which is why we're looking at such things as 1946. The fact that during the elections of 1946, the Muslim League had now become the predominant party by far among the Muslims, which was not the case in 1937. So, you know, some historians have argued that this was the best kept secret in the world, the fact that Jinnah was really sick, right? But that's not really interesting, because there are much greater forces, as I'm suggesting to you, at work here. So then there's the independence of India. Gandhi, who had been the dominant figure in Indian history for the last 30 years, exercises no power at all. He's not going to be a part of the government at all. Okay? And that's another long, interesting chapter. Nehru is going to become the first prime minister. Vallabhbhai Patel, known as Sardar Patel in more colloquial parlance, Sardar, the Iron Man of India, as he used to be known. Sardar Patel is going to become the deputy prime minister, the home minister. Maulana Azad is a very prominent Indian Muslim who is a staunch opponent of the idea of partition, a staunch opponent of the idea of the two-nation theory. Right? Because as far as he's concerned, India is as much of a home to Muslims as any other place in the world. In fact, a more hospitable home from his standpoint. Right? So he's going to be the kind of Indian Muslim nationalist who is not going to go over to Pakistan in 1947, and he's going to be given a position of some eminence in the Indian government because he'd been a major figure, of course. Now, before independence, in late 1946, they appoint what is called the Constituent Assembly of India. The Constituent Assembly of India is, and I'm going to speak about this in my next lecture, the Constitution of India at greater length, because I want to just cover a little bit more terrain of the political history, but I want to just briefly tell you about it right now so that you can start thinking about it. What was the function of the Constituent Assembly? The function of the Constituent Assembly was to draft a constitution for the new Republic of India. Right? So India has not yet come into being as an independent state, but Of course, it's now clear because it's been announced that there's going to be a transfer of power, there's going to be independence, and in late 1946, a group of people is going to be formed, which is called the Constituent Assembly, and they are going to be charged with the task of creating a new constitution. This new constitution is an exceedingly interesting document, but we're going to look at it, as I said, a little bit later, perhaps later, in the next 10-15 minutes if we get that far. Otherwise, the first item that I'm going to cover in my lecture next week. And as I said, it's going to be charged with the task of drafting the Constitution. I've already talked about the population transfers, the partition killings, the abduction of women, princely states and British India. Let's go back to this subject now. Okay. So I mentioned to you that at the time of partition, all of these states had essentially three options, right? And this is what the Treaty of Accession refers to, that each state agrees to being absorbed either into India or being absorbed into Pakistan, or tries to be an independent state. There were some states, native states, which were very resistant to the idea of being absorbed into India. Okay? The first example we want to look at is Hyderabad, the state of Hyderabad, a huge entity here, ruled by a man known as the Nizam. Okay, Muslim majority again, and we are not, by the way, we haven't looked at the nuances of what it means to be a Muslim, because of course there's not one single kind of Muslim. It's not like being a Muslim is a monolithic entity. There were Shias who did not at all support the idea of the creation of Pakistan. In fact, the All India Shia Conference, right? So the All India Shia Conference is an organization that represents the interests of India's Shias, voted against the partition plan. They did not support it. Okay? Yes? As opposed to the Sunni population, yes. But we're just taking the broad distinction here, right? Because then we could look at, groups within organizations within each of these folds, but under the broad rubric of Sunnis and Shias, there was very little support for the creation of Pakistan among the Shias. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a much greater conviviality and relationship between the Shias and the Hindu population. So Hyderabad had a considerable Shia population. The other place is Lucknow over here, which you saw on the other map. In fact, Lucknow has an extraordinary history because its ruler, the Nawab of Awadh as he used to be known, he was deposed by the British in 1856, 1857. That's supposed to be one of the many reasons why a rebellion broke out in 1857 and 58, because Indians were offended at how their rulers were being treated by an expansionist British regime. Right? The Nawab of Awadh belonged to a Shia family. And the Nawabs of Awadh had an exceedingly cosmopolitan outlook. For example, they had very close relationship with Iran, which is of course a predominantly Shia country. Very close relationship with Iran. The Nawab of Awadh himself had exceedingly close relationships with a large number of Hindus. Okay? And so, putting it in a very capsule form, what I'm suggesting to you is that one of the many problems that one could look at is, what elements of the Muslim population in fact supported this plan for the creation of the state of Pakistan and what elements didn't. Okay? And we know that the Shias, for reasons that I've described to you, namely the fact that they had much closer relationship with Hindus, the fact that there was much closer proximity in religious practices between the Hindus and the Shias. It was very common for Hindus to take part in the Muharram festival. Very common. And this is going to transfer overseas. If you go to Trinidad, for example, where a large Indian population is going to arise by the late 19th century, because Trinidad was a British colony. And when you had the abolition of slavery in 1835, the big landlords needed a labor force. What did they do? They imported this labor force from India. Right? So if I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Trinidad, but you would know that the Indians are an enormous presence. And when I say enormous, I'm talking about the fact that at one point they constituted 50% of the population of Trinidad. Now it's dwindled down to about 42, 43%. Okay? And what is the relevance of that? If you look at the history of Trinidad, late 19th century, the Muharram festival, which is a Shia festival predominantly, huge Hindu participation in that festival. Something that they had carried this sensibility from India when they went to Trinidad in the late 19th century. Right? So now, if we go back to this map here, we're saying we've got one problem that we need to think about. What happens when a native ruler, such as a ruler of Hyderabad, decides that, hey, I don't want to sign a treaty with India, I don't want to be absorbed into India, and I don't want to be absorbed into Pakistan either. And even if I did want to be absorbed into Pakistan, it's not possible. You're, after all, in South India, you're miles away, hundreds of miles away from either the western end of Pakistan or the eastern end of Pakistan. Right? So the only other option you have is to retain your autonomy and become a separate nation state. Now, apart from geopolitical considerations, such as how does a nation state, let's assume that Hyderabad becomes a separate nation state, it's completely landlocked, you can see that, there's no outlet to the sea, to the ocean, right? It's surrounded on all four sides by India, and it has been historically a part of India. Would India ever permit something like that to happen? The answer is no. And so what is India going to do? Just one second, let me just finish this train of thought. What is India going to do? It's going to initiate, they use a euphemism, it's going to initiate what's called police action. Police action means they are eventually going to force the hand of the ruler of Hyderabad. And when they force his hand, what it means, and again I'm simplifying it because there are going to be a number of different political factions within Hyderabad. And each of them has its own particular outlook of what it thinks is the most desirable outcome, political outcome. Okay? But police action effectively means that the Indian army is going to move into Hyderabad and is going to basically take over the place and it's going to be absorbed into India. And that's the end of the story. Yes?
Aren't there a couple countries like that, though, completely landlocked in South Africa?
Oh yeah, look, I'm not saying that it's not possible under any circumstances for a landlocked country to exist. That's not the claim here, but I'm saying that if you look at the historical contingencies over here, it was not possible. Yeah.
Was it true that the partition basically made it so the Indian government or National Congress wouldn't tolerate any attitudes of secession or give the princely states any option of autonomy?
Say the question again. Let me think.
Was it true that the actual event of the partition of
Yeah.
India made it so like basically the government of India wouldn't tolerate any autonomy from princely states?
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say that the idea that the Indian state would tolerate the autonomy was not acceptable. No. Right? So that if any ruler claimed that he was going to be an autonomous ruler, of course we can be, by the way, you can have limited degree of autonomy within a federal structure. So you could have a federated union of Indian states, which would have, of course, been one way to avoid the question of partition. And this was obviously thought about, right? What if you create a highly federated structure over here? So you've got, some things that are going to be given to the center, and then the states will have enormous autonomy, okay, in various matters such as defense, foreign relations even, right? You might have to impose some constraints there because usually those are the things that you do not give to the states. So for example, in the United States, okay, defense is common. There are states' rights, and in most matters, states' rights are important. Laws, for example, with respect to ownership of guns, education, right? How a city maintains its own streets, so forth and so on. All of these are going to be matters that are going to be handed over to local jurisdictions and state jurisdiction. Right? But then there are some matters that you do not hand over to the states. And among them is obviously defense, usually foreign relations. But in the case of India, there were a number of possibilities that were entertained in order to keep India together in order to avoid the partition. And one of them was that you would have to have a kind of a union, a federation of Indian states, which would be only loosely bound together by custom, convention, culture, history, but that in most respects all of these areas would have autonomy. Right? That was one possible solution, but that didn't happen. So then the question now, to go back to a question as to what degree was the Indian government after 1947 willing to permit autonomy to those who wanted it, the answer is it wasn't. It wasn't. For the reason that most nation states will not permit autonomy. If a portion of California, let's say Los Angeles to San Francisco, it's the blue belt, okay, more blue than any other place, let's say. Okay, gay rights, this and that, things that people in Nebraska or Idaho might not like at all. So let's supposing that a 400-mile stretch from, LA to San Francisco decided we're just going to become a separate nation state. Do you think that the United States will tolerate that or permit it? The answer is no. Emphatically no. For the same reason that, of course, and that's what the Civil War is about. It's about what happens when you have movements of secessionism. Right? So would it have permitted movements of secessionism? I want to use that phrase why, because it will help us understand the continuities with post-1947 history. Okay? And further down in the middle of the quarter, we're going to be looking at a number of secessionist movements. Movements led by people who say, we want to break away from this unitary structure called India. So here you have police action. Hyderabad is going to be absorbed. The more difficult question is Kashmir, okay, which remains unresolved down to the present day, as I'm sure some of you know. Kashmir had an Indian ruler, a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh. The vast population of Kashmir, however, was Muslim. Now, usually the Treaty of Accession is signed by the ruler of the state. It's signed by the ruler of the state, obviously, right? And so the Treaty of Accession means that you sit down and you say, I relinquish my rights to this state, and this state now becomes absorbed into the territories of India or Pakistan, whatever the case might be. The majority of the states, of course, signed a Treaty of Accession with India. The ones that were at the border, so if you happen to be close to what becomes eventually West Pakistan, some of those states would sign a Treaty of Accession to Pakistan. Now, Kashmir there is on the top. It includes the Srinagar Valley. Sometimes it's been argued probably the most beautiful spot in the world. Quite likely it is. If you've ever seen it, you would know, right? Okay, so, and a prized possession, geopolitically speaking. Geopolitically speaking, because if you saw a geopolitical map of South Asia and Central Asia, then you would see that, well, they've got borders that are shared with China. And then, of course, if you think about the great game, as it used to be called by Kipling in his novel Kim, and as it has continued down to the present day, what's going on in Afghanistan today? Why is it that the great powers have always been interested? I mean, remember that before the Americans became involved, someone else was involved. I hope you remember that. The Soviets. The Soviets had gone in there and of course that leads us to Osama bin Laden and all of that, because one of the things that the Americans did in order to throw the Soviets out was to encourage jihadi movements there in Afghanistan. That's the history. And before the Soviets, you had the British. And they say very often that Afghanistan becomes the graveyard of whoever goes there. The British suffered enormous embarrassments and losses in Afghanistan. They simply could not really take it over. Okay? And what are the other elements of that cultural history? Does it have to do with the bravery of the Pathans and this and that? Does it have to do with the rugged terrain? We won't really enter into all of these questions, but I think it's more or less an incontestable fact that if you have a great power going into Afghanistan, it's going to run into some trouble. Okay? And although we should also be very cautious when you say that it's become the graveyard, because it's become the graveyard for the British and the Soviets and maybe the Americans, but the Afghans lost huge number of lives in turning it into a graveyard for somebody else. Nobody thinks about that, Okay, so there's been large loss of life and cultural inheritance in that part of the world going back to 100, 150 years, at least. So now Kashmir is there, it's geopolitically strategic, the ruler is undecided. When August 15th comes about, okay, remember that these treaties of accession, they're not all being signed in one day. Some of the rulers have to be persuaded, they have to be cajoled, they have to be offered some bribes, you know. Well, you know, if you decide to relinquish your territories, we agree to give you a sum of money which will be given to you in perpetuity, or it will be given to you for 100 years to you and your family members for a period of 100 years or 50 years. Various kinds of inducements have to be offered. In some cases, it's not necessary because some of the states are so small that they can't afford to really grumble, right? I mean, because all India has to do is just walk in, or Pakistan, all they have to do is just walk in and take over the place. Right? Now, Kashmir is obviously a very big place. It has, you know, the Srinagar Valley, which is, as I said, you know, if you look at the literary historical records, a place that is unmatched for its beauty. It's of geopolitical significance. The problem is that the ruler is a Hindu. If he decides to sign the Treaty of Accession, is he representing his people? Because 90% of his subjects are Muslims. Right? 90% of his subjects are Muslims. And Pakistan, and of course it borders Pakistan, and Pakistan wants to claim Kashmir for itself. Right? So you're going to have a dispute over this. And the Pakistani side has one narrative, as in all disputes, and the Indian side has another narrative of what exactly happened. Okay? And I'm not going to try to be neutral necessarily in this. I'm going to tell you what I think from my reading is what I think is the most acceptable version of what transpired. And what transpires is that shortly after August 1947, Pakistan is going to attempt to force the hand of the ruler. They want to prod him into making a decision. Of course, Nehru, who is the Prime Minister of India, is prodding the Maharaja as well. But Nehru's prodding and the Pakistani prodding are two different things. Because what the Pakistanis are really going to do is, they're going to essentially send what are called infiltrators. They're going to send a large number of people who are actually going to be dressed as villagers, as peasants, and they're going to try to take over Srinagar, because Srinagar is the heart. We'd have to look at a detailed map of Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu is a lower portion, by the way, so the state is called Jammu and Kashmir. The portion on the top is Kashmir. The lower portion, which also has, by the way, a substantial Sikh population. So that's the lower foothills. When you get into Kashmir, you start to get into the real Himalayan range. Okay? And the other thing I want to mention is that, you know, when the line that is drawn, again, it's the Boundary Commission, but you have more detailed work that is going to be done on Kashmir, on how exactly the line is going to be drawn there. Right now, for those of you who are interested, there is what is called the LOC. LOC is the acronym for Line of Control, okay, which is not the same as the official line on the map. And you'll understand the difference later on. Let me go back to 1947, late 1947, second half of 1947. So you're going to have these Pakistani infiltrators and raiders who are quite close to Srinagar. At which point the Maharaja of Kashmir sends a desperate message to Nehru, come and rescue me, help me. And Nehru says, I will only help you on the condition that you sign a treaty of accession. And to cut a long story short, the Maharaja signs a treaty of accession. He signs a treaty. He says, I relinquish my territories and this now becomes part of India. So treaty is signed. Of course, the Pakistani claim, and you could say that the claim is not incorrect, the Pakistani claim is that, well, this is not a real treaty because this is signed under coercion. It's signed under coercion because Nehru is saying that, well, I'm only going to come and help you, I'm going to save your neck, but I'll only save it if you agree to relinquish your rights over this territory and it becomes a part of India. That a treaty, and they're going to sign, they're going to claim the philosophical high ground. The philosophical high ground is that a treaty that is signed under coercion is not a real treaty. right? But a treaty is signed. And eventually the Indian army is going to move into Srinagar. Now you have, but the Pakistanis are spread all over because there are, of course, people who have gone into Srinagar, but there are also people who are trying to control other parts of what is called the Srinagar Valley. So what you really have is you have, I don't know if I'm going to call it a full-scale war, but it's a lot more than a skirmish. It's somewhere in between. Okay? It's a lot more than a skirmish. It's a lot more than just a few small battles here and there, but it's not a full-scale war that we're really talking about at this point in time. But the hostilities are going to erupt between the two countries. Eventually, the United Nations is going to be drawn into it, and there's going to be a ceasefire. Okay? That's the history that I want you to think about up till 1947, late 1947, early 1948. The remaining essential part of the story, which will conclude our narrative about 1946 to early 1948, before we move into the next section, is something I'm going to talk about in the beginning of my lecture on Tuesday, and that is the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, on 30th January 1948. Okay? And an assassination that is effectively going to coincide with the end of the partition killings. Right? Because these killings that I've talked about, where 1 million people are killed, the transfer of populations, when did this come to an end? Around the time of Gandhi's assassination. And what role the assassination might have had in prodding people into saying that, well, look, a great calamity has fallen, let's just come back to our senses and think about what's been going on. And that's an interesting question, but certainly the partition killings are going to end roughly around that time. So that's where we're going to start on Tuesday, okay?